I think it's very important to look at South Africa and the United States specifically. And I also really want us to get to a point. I did a commentary on this last week, which you can look up if you haven't watched yet. It was one of the YouTube streams on global movements, South Africa, and integral thought. And I'll be doing a lot more on the integral line of things and potentially trying to create a healthier synthesis in the culture and some transcending of all of these really, really toxic, grotesque dichotomies we're in right now. But also, one of and connected with that is the idea of like, can we really get to a point where we're actually discoursing globally, where the United States is not just exporting its discourses, whatever they may be, including justice discourses, and not learning just as much from the rest of the world, frankly. And again, this isn't just like, it's my sensibility as someone who's cosmopolitan internationalist, but it's also really, really necessary because there's lessons about how these things work, how politics works, that are exemplified here. I mean, the work of obviously Adolph Reed and Torrey Reed and Cedric Johnson in following the trajectory of post-60s identity politics, civil rights, socialism, labor, and neoliberalism. That explains how the United States, that explains where we are today better than any other methodology we have. And even in South Africa, where there's so many parallels between the apartheid system in the United States, Jim Crow, and other related policies and areas of structural racism and apartheid itself. And it's very, very important because, again, we need to be real about things that have changed. There is not legal apartheid in the United States, and there's not legal apartheid in South Africa. And South Africa, in fact, was liberated by, as I always say, the most iconic liberation movement of the 21st century, of the 20th century. And just as we discussed with William Shockey, please read Africa as a Country. Policing in South Africa is among the most violent in the world and viciously targets poor people and Black South Africans and continues those legacies of apartheid because they are rooted in racism, but also in capitalism. And similarly, in the United States, it is not just a question of like a shoehorning of like the left sentiment or whatever. It is an actual choice. It's a departure point. Do things go to HR? Do things go to various stupidities and toxicities and nonsense on social media? Ultimately, does it become a question of the individual, which it is most decidedly not? Of course, everybody should improve individually as they can. But these are structure questions. They're questions of power, they're questions of institutional bias, and they're questions of material redistribution. The connection, as soon as you see the stats about police killings, please connect that to over 30,000 people dying a year because they don't have health insurance, including between 7,000 and 8,000 African Americans. I want to play this clip, some of this clip of Ronnie Kasrils, who's a former, I've interviewed him. He was a liberation fighter for the South African Communist Party, for the African National Congress. He co-founded the Armed Wing with, among others, Nelson Mandela in the 1960s. He served as Deputy Defense Secretary under Nelson Mandela. He served as Intelligence Minister under Thabo Mbeki. Here he is explaining a couple of years ago to Democracy Now!, and you can go back in the archives as well, the democratic transition in South Africa after this extraordinary victory, and then the economic dimension. And then remind yourselves of Vivek Chibber explaining these identitarian frameworks as fundamentally class politics and where we're in today and the trajectory of politics and where we need to go.
Because it doesn't really do very much. The fact is that if Mandela had a Marxist orientation, which he certainly did, I would say, for some time, that was dispelled when he emerges from prison 30 years or so later, where he immediately, in a major, his first address to our people, he commits himself to the socialist inclined Freedom Charter, and the clause that is quite emphatic, although it doesn't use the word nationalization, but says that what we committed to is the control of the heights of the economy, the mines, the banks, the monopoly industry, and it's inconceivable that that will change. Right. 2 years later, he shows a totally different view on the economy by going to Davos, 1992, July, very impressed, clearly, as he was in South Africa, by the voice of monopoly capital. I'm not saying he bows down to it, but he's certainly impressed in terms of what they're able to do, and comes back from Davos and says that for growth of the economy, we've got to look to the private sector. And he says that it's clear that if we go for radical socialist approach, he uses the term nationalization, we're not going to get the foreign investment from the capitalist world that we need to make the country and to overcome our profit.
So I want to just say, I think, and I have more sympathy than others, I think the ANC was 100% right. They liberated South Africa. The Soviet Union was collapsing. Globalization that was rooted in the history of a ruthless U.S. Cold War, of course, Soviet Union as well, but the U.S. won. And if we read, we'll have in a couple of weeks, the interview's already done, the Jakarta method with Vincent Bevins. You cannot separate that form of globalization from U.S. liquidation and murder campaigns across every corner of the earth, including very much so in Africa. The ANC fought on the other side of that. In the merging into the 1990s, there is no choice. This is the height of there is no other way of Tina. So I don't blame the ANC. Some of them became corrupt. Some of them moved to the right, sure. But the restriction was quite clear. But Casrils is 100% right. You have this extraordinary historic liberation, and you have the capacity, and the policy shifts quickly. And Becky pushes through gear, which is privatization, tight fiscal policy. There is some social investment, but instead of the Freedom Charter, which was about redistribution and nationalization, in addition to ending all forms of ethnic and racial discrimination, they decide we can make a group of wealthy Black entrepreneurs. So, and again, the same dynamic. That's better. We will pick diversity capitalism over white supremacy capitalism every day of the week. But that is not the fight that is going to get rid of poverty and actually create a decent condition for all. It's simply not. Mm-hmm. And ascendant today, again, because it is a class politics, is a politics that feeds even emergent, the uprising that we've seen, as urgent as they are, into not only sort of, stuff in the cultural realm, which we can critique, and I do, but also very, very explicitly a class-oriented identitarian politics that is not about full across-the-board economic, social, and racial liberation. If we look at the situation right now in the States, if we think of those three areas, the base of material redistribution, the necessity and historical struggle flowing out of, I'll just keep saying, the rights revolution of the 60s to secure the full and complete democratic legal rights for all, and then this realm of cultural whatever, wokeness. There is a lot happening on that level. Some of it's great, like getting rid of the Confederate monuments, some of which has been for years now extremely toxic and counterproductive, and some of it just isn't one way or another politics, ultimately. The substantive rights revolution has been under siege. 2013, the Roberts Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. There's acts of systemic job discrimination all over the place. And we talked even how that book and the training of things like white fragility are used by companies actually to insulate themselves when they're held legally accountable for their discriminatory practices. And then, of course, in the base, inequality and the absolute mass concentration of wealth continues at an accelerated pace in COVID. So this is the playing field. And I hope that if we look at these global comparisons, we can start to have a genuinely global outlook, which has a good value in and of itself. And we can start to understand how these things actually operate.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.